Our next speaker is Dr. Renuka Badhe, who's the Executive Secretary of the European Polar Board, which is based in the Netherlands. Renuka's role is to guide and implement the EPB's vision and objectives to oversee communication and represent EPB at international fora, like the Arctic Frontiers. Renuka holds a PhD on Southern Ocean phytoplankton physiology and other degrees in environmental sciences, economics, and public policy. Renuka has previously worked with organizations such as the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, SCAR, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and the University of Cambridge. She is an advocate of diversity, both gender and geographical, in academia. She's interested in promoting polar research to wide audiences using a variety of traditional and non-traditional communication tools. Renuka has experience with various aspects of polar science, policy, and strategy development, and the interface between them form her principle of work. Renuka will be speaking today about the European Polar Board at the confluence of science and policy in the polar regions. Please give a good hand to Renuka as she takes the stage.
Thank you very much, Kiki. Tracy's talk is a tough act to follow, but I'll try. So I'm here speaking on behalf of the European Polar Board. And I'm quite excited to announce that this is the first event for our 25th anniversary celebrations. So the EPB has recently entered its 25th year, and we are going to have quite a few events. So we'll talk about this a bit later, but I'm really happy to announce that. So the EPB's main mission, EPB is a collection of its member organizations, and its main mission is to promote, to coordinate, and to advance science and research in the polar regions. Its main strength is its members. So we have 27 member organizations currently, and they straddle all disciplines and all aspects of work in the polar regions. We have some members that are experts in logistics in the polar regions, some members that are experts in the research aspect, and quite a few members that work across both poles. Our strength is our members' abilities. Again, our members represent organizations that either manage or own ships, research facilities, and also research aircraft in the polar regions. So yes, the EPB has a really nice structure where it can sit very well between the science and policy aspects and then work across these two. And hence, we are really at the confluence. It provides a single contact point if needed, where if you want to reach all of the polar research organization, EPB forms a really good single contact point. Our members actively also share best practice and knowledge, and also across the polar regions, because quite a lot of times, knowledge that has been gained in one pole is as applicable to the other pole as well. The way EPB works is either through specific action groups or through projects. And I'll try and give an example of both of these. So one of our main projects which we have on now, where EPB is a coordinator with the European Space Agency, is something that we are helping to gain scientific expertise for potential long-term space travel, probably around to the Mars region. So I don't know if I can use the pointer, but kind of towards the top left-hand side of that graph. This project is called Choice Epidemiology, and we are working with ESA and the University of Munich. This project started out as a small experiment within the research station Concordia on Antarctica, which is run by two of our members, IPEV, which is the French agency, and PNR, which is the Italian agency. Some of the researchers noticed that due to long-term isolation within this Concordia station, the people who lived there for overwinters, they were more likely to gain allergic responses. And this kind of made them think, and they've put together a large project now, and they're trying to assess how living in long-term isolation for research, for employees at these research stations is affecting their health, specifically in terms of allergic response. So this really helps out both ESA because they are gaining knowledge for their long-term space travel, whereas it helps out in the smaller term for EPB's members so that they can make better health for their own employees that are stationed at these research facilities. It also has long-term policy impacts because the results that are gained out of these experiments can also inform policy for people that live in the polar regions who also are isolated to for quite long times in different seasons. So another example of a couple of examples of our action groups, we have an action group on polar infrastructure and an action group on environmental impacts of polar research and logistics. So our action group on infrastructure, the main activity that they're trying to do is to work towards understanding what the access needs are for different facilities in both polar regions. Now every organization that has a research facility has their own requirements for accessing these. And it becomes quite difficult for researchers when they're trying to access research facilities that are not based in their own organization. So what we're trying to do is to gather this information together so it makes it incredibly useful for all researchers to do their work without the small impediments about not understanding or not being able to provide the needs for accessing different research infrastructures. So we have made a start on this, and we have a tool already on the EPB's website. So if all of you are interested in this is the EPB's infrastructure catalog. This has all of the research facilities that are European owned or managed, about 67 of them, both in the Arctic and Antarctic. And this is freely available to everyone. We also have a PDF copy of the catalog that's also freely available. And we will build on this in the coming years to ensure that the requirements for accessing these infrastructures are also built within that catalog. Now, our next action group is working on the environmental impacts of polar research. We've heard quite a lot of talks in the last 2 days about how the climate is changing around the world and how our actions have impacts on the climate. Now, even research has its impact on the climate. When we have to travel to long distances, we have to travel to gather information, we have to travel to conferences like these. What we are trying to do is trying to collect examples of guidelines and also best practice examples that already exist within our member organizations. We are trying to identify the gaps that exist, and we are trying to provide information to address these gaps. A lot of times, in this case particularly, there's a lot of knowledge sharing which is happening on this action group across the Arctic and Antarctic, because there's particular expertise that's being developed at either poles, and we can really fill a lot of gaps by ensuring that the two polar regions talk to each other. What we expect from this group in the next few months is a synthesis report, and we will be having, again, it will be freely available to everyone, and it will ensure that we have best practice examples and also recommendations, mainly from the EPB members to the EP members, but they are obviously applicable to everyone else as well. We also ensure that we coordinate with all the other organizations that are working in the polar region, so we are not duplicating work. So everyone knows what's going on, and everyone is able to share that knowledge the best of their abilities. So the main areas of work and what we expect in this synthesis report is use of plastics. We have impact of research activities. So you have things like impact wildlife. If researchers are trying to access particular locations, what are the impacts? Are there any impacts, and how do you minimize those impacts? And then also direct and cumulative impacts of research by doing research in the polar regions. And we have a little bit of an outline that we've already created. So we are hopefully going to finalize this in the next few months, and the synthesis report will include things like legal frameworks that are present in the different organizations, type of research activities and what are their impacts, the recommendations and practical guidelines, and hopefully we'll also have summaries for various stakeholders so everyone can take out of it what they need and what they require. So moving on from the action groups, we have, like I said, we also have a lot of work with projects, and I'll provide a couple of examples from external projects that we work with. Something called EU-PolarNet was set up, and it came up from the EPB as a collaborative platform. EU-PolarNet was set up, it's got 22 members in this project, and most of these members are also members of the European Polar Board. So one of the activities that the EU-PolarNet project had was to try and assess and provide priorities in polar research. What is Europe looking for? What does Europe want in terms of polar research? And those priorities we had hoped, the hope was that they would address policy requests as well. So this started off with trying to understand what the current priorities are, which are already printed by all of the member organizations and also all the researchers. And we came up with 10 overarching themes within all of these documents. That ended up with something called a white paper workshop, because the goal of this activity in the project was to create a set of white papers that addressed what the members thought was a priority, a requirement for research priorities. We made sure that the people who were sitting in the workshop were representing not just themselves, but also their broad communities. So we had a large variety of stakeholders. We had industry partners, we had indigenous people, we had scientists, we had logistics managers, and we came up with a set of 5 white papers. Now these are all available publicly on EU-PolarNet's website. And the result was that we saw that these white papers we had calls that came up from the European Commission that were trying to address these priorities that we had brought out. So this was a direct policy response to the science that we had put forward. So two of our white papers came forward with these 2 calls. The other 2 also came up with calls. And the 5th white paper that we had produced didn't have a dedicated call, but we saw that the themes that were covered in that white paper were cross-cutting across all the different calls. So the work that we had done, we now see its activities. Now we have the policy response, there's funding, and hopefully there'll be projects that are funded and work within these priority areas that have been identified by researchers, by everyone actually, not just researchers. And this is, so stakeholder engagement, there were quite a lot of, because we had worked with a lot of different stakeholders, we also came up with a set of stakeholder engagement lessons learned aspect. And this might be repeating Tracy's work a little bit, because we had very similar responses. We had very similar lessons learned. that you have to gain everyone's respect and trust. You have to ensure that the effort, that time and effort that everyone puts in is, you make sure that it's, you value that time and effort. And you also value expertise from the different areas that the stakeholders are coming from. You also need to accept that there are administrative and other constraints, time constraints for different stakeholders that you work with. And you have to understand that not all stakeholders that the researchers are interested in might be interested in your work. So you have to kind of give them that space. And that's why the aspect of co-designing that Tracy was also talking about becomes so much more important. So the areas where stakeholders and researchers have common interests will be co-designed, and that kind of makes the best results at the end of the day. So we came up with some recommendations as well, and again, this is almost repeating Tracy's talk, but it's an important lesson. So you have to build trust. You have to give time for that trust building with different stakeholders. And you have to have participation of stakeholders, not just going and asking for their advice and then coming back and do your own thing. You have to make sure that all the stakeholders you want to work with are part of the project. You have to also identify questions or what the research needs are from the local communities. You have to invest time and money. And this is very, very important. And a lot of times, the money aspect is not underlined hard enough, because some of the stakeholders that you'd like to involve in your work may not have the time or the money to travel or to participate in your project. So you really have to ensure that there's enough time and money set aside. And you have to ensure that if you can't work with stakeholders directly, you have contact with the intermediaries, because a lot of times you'll have organizations that are like the EPB, that are umbrella organizations that will represent your stakeholders. So you have to have contact with them. So these are also available online. And with that, I thank you very much. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to present the EPB and its work here.